The book has a brief section on shielding, and I think there are two distinct levels of shielding that you need to worry about. The first is just your common electromagnetic interference, such as that from fluorescent lights or microwaves or power strips or that heaters, that sort of thing. Those typical components that can cause problems with your computer equipment. You can take that up a whole nother level into actually shielding your computer equipment from sending out signals, stray signals that could be intercepted. The book talks about something called a Faraday cage, and we had that in the oil industry in our computer room. It was actually a big wire cage that was built into the walls and the ceiling and the floor to minimize any kind of leaking, EMI leaking that would come out of your computer equipment. And on the next page in your text, the book talks about Project Tempest, which is something that's kind of similar. You can use special testing equipment just to see what kind of electronic signals might be emitted from your computer equipment. Again, in Missoula, mostly you need to worry about space heaters and fluorescent lights, that sort of thing. The last physical section that they discuss here is fire suppression. In larger computer operations, halon systems used to be pretty common, except those would also take all the oxygen out of the room, and so that was not good for people to use. And so you don't tend to see those too much. You see a lot of sprinkler systems, but with electrical equipment, that's not a very good solution either. Subsection 2 in Chapter 6 deals with understanding business continuity planning. And I think for most of you, this is going to be new information unless you've actually been involved in network management before or have owned your own business. Business continuity planning is a pretty long process that deals with setting up security, identifying critical business components, determining what the effect of outages for those critical business components are, and then figuring how the best way is to mitigate any outages that could come up or standard risks that you might encounter in keeping your business running at 100%. This section of the chapter has all sorts of acronyms in here. I'll try to not use the acronyms just to make sure that you're clear on what the functions are. But the chapter does say that two of the key components of continuity planning is doing a business impact analysis and doing a risk assessment. Business impact analysis actually looks at what you do in your job, what your standard business functions are. And then the risk assessment is looking at your critical functions and then doing some guesswork, some educated guesswork, as to how susceptible those processes are to some sort of an outage or interference. Now, for the most part, you as an IT specialist are not going to be able to answer all of these questions. You might know what's critical from your IT perspective, but the business owner's perspective may be a whole lot different, and IT may not be the most critical thing that you have to worry about. When you sit down with management and they identify what the critical business functions are, this is, from their perspective, what needs to happen, what needs to be available for them to be able to conduct business. In a manufacturing environment, manufacturing and sales, probably the most important thing is having telephone access so that you can communicate with customers and so that they can call in to you. If you have a fire and your entire facility is wiped out, you're obviously going to have to deal with production issues. But the most critical thing that you're going to have to do is make sure that your salespeople can contact their clients and that the clients can call back in. And so maybe having a whole bunch of cell phones and having an agreement with your cell phone provider to reroute calls on your landlines back to your cell phones is going to be one of the most critical things that you can do in order to keep business going. You have to identify those critical functions, and then the owner has to categorize what those critical functions are. And that's going to be your blueprint for what you need to establish in terms of recovering from a disaster. One of the important things to keep in mind is what kind of a time frame do you have where you can stand an outage and it's not going to severely impact your business. Obviously, any kind of an outage is going to have some impact on your business. You can deal with some very brief outages, but for something that's longer than that, you need to know what that time frame is. If you can go, let's say, 4 hours without email access, then that gives you a window to get things going again. If you can't deal with a 4-hour outage and your window's actually down to 30 minutes, that gives you a much tighter time frame, and you're going to have to be able to respond more quickly and have more things in place so that you can roll over within a 30-minute time frame. As part of that whole process is you have to figure out what the direct costs are going to be, and that's usually not too hard to calculate. And then you also have to assess the indirect costs. I think the book talks about these in terms of tangible and intangible. Still, there is a cost associated with any kind of an outage. If you've got business dealings that require you to respond by 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning and you don't have email available to do that, you can count that and assess that pretty easily. If somebody is trying to contact you and they can't get information back and forth at 10 o'clock, there may be a loss of goodwill or some other more intangible impact to your business. And it's a good idea, even if you can't put a dollar amount on all of these, to at least list these, again, so that you know what your exposure is and you can determine just how critical it is to keep this function up or how long you can tolerate an outage. So once you have established what some of your critical functions are, the next thing is to take those critical functions and look at all the different things that could cause an interruption to that. If internet access is a critical function, then depending on the type of access that you have, you can evaluate how likely a risk or an outage event could take place. If you are running on a physical circuit, a wire coming into your building, you could have a risk with the carrier's equipment having an issue. You could have a risk with a cable being cut, and I know that's happened in Missoula a couple different times, and that has really wiped out both cell phone and landline and internet coverage. Those are the sorts of things that you're going to be looking at. If you've got a satellite connection, then sometimes heavy snow or really heavy rain can be an outage for you. If that is the issue, then in terms of redundancy, maybe a satellite system or a wireless system is not going to be your best choice for a backup, and you want to make sure that you've got a landline. So you've got two different methods that will not necessarily be affected by the same thing. Of course, if you have some sort of a nuclear explosion or an earthquake, then a lot of times you can't separate those things and everything will be affected by that. So what you do is you go through your list of critical business functions and you figure out all the different things that could happen, and then create yet a third list of ways that you can minimize the impact to that. There is a formula that the book discusses. This can help you figure out sort of a dollar cost associated with an outage. And this is where you can do some research into longevity of hardware. There are annualized projections for fire, for earthquakes, for all sorts of different things. And you can actually get numbers for all this and come up with a reasonable estimate of what your susceptibility is. The three components here are your annualized rate of occurrence, which is in a given year, how likely is it that you will encounter some sort of a power loss or that you will have a fire in your facility. There is an annualized rate of occurrence for all of these different things. So that's one component. The next is your single loss expectancy, and this is a dollar amount that you can assign to a single outage. So the number of times you expect it to occur a year times the cost per year gives you what's called an annual loss expectancy. And this is a dollar amount that you can expect on average that you will lose because of whatever this condition is. If you look at the real world scenario, option 3 I think is a really good example of this. The idea is that you work at a help desk for a small company, and one of the most common requests that you have to deal with is somebody accidentally deleted a file. Depending on what you've set up for your backup and recovery system, you could have to go through the process of finding the tape, bringing it back from off-site, loading the tape, running the restore job, and then finally the user has that information available to them. That process takes 2 hours, then you can calculate what the cost is to your business for that. If that happens an awful lot and you've got a high dollar amount associated with the fact that you've got to recover files for people, then maybe what you want to do is have nearline backups so that you don't have to go through the tape process. You can go to an alternate drive and recover it. Another option might be to use the volume shadow service and have the user go back in time and pick up the most recent file. And so you might cut your outage from 2 hours to maybe 5 minutes. Of course, there might be some overhead associated with this, or there might be some cost in setting up nearline storage. But if the cost of that is lower than the cost that you are currently expending in terms of lost time, then you've got a really good business case for going ahead and doing that. And that's where you can use some of these hard dollars to implement changes that are going to be beneficial to the company.